Good morning, Tangible Grace. It's good to, again, share with you. We're walking through a series on the parables this week as we continue to dive in to what does it mean to tell the stories Jesus told in a meaningful way, in a way that actually makes sense to our modern culture, in a way that can teach us how do we tell stories well as well. How do we use the same approach that Jesus did with people that didn't yet know him? So when Jesus was around the crowds, we unpacked this last week. I encourage you to watch that sermon if you haven't seen it yet. Jesus, when he is around the crowds, he has a habit of telling stories, of telling parables. This week we're going to dive into Luke chapter 6 and Luke 12. We'll start in Luke 6. It starts in verse 46. It says, Jesus says, "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do what I tell you? Everyone who comes to me and hears my words and does them, I'll show you what he is like." And then he begins to tell a story. He begins to tell this parable about a man who builds two kinds of houses. We may be familiar with the version of this in Matthew, where Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount tells a similar story about a man who builds his house on the rock and the sand. This story is slightly different. This is not the Sermon on the Mount, but the Sermon on the plain, the flat place. And there's some slight differences between the two. We'll notice a couple of things. Verse 48, it says, "He is like a man building a house who dug deep and laid the foundation on the rock. And when a flood arose, the stream broke against that house and could not shake it because it had been well built." Or other translations say, or founded upon the rock. But the one who hears and does them does not do them is like a man who built a house on the ground without a foundation, no foundation. And when not if, but when a stream broke against them, immediately it fell, and the ruin of that house was great. So the difference between this story and the one in Matthew, this is more of a river flooding versus like waves coming and crashing against like a storm on the beach, right? Because he says sand versus rock. And so here it's building a foundation ready for a flood because they're in a flat place. Jesus is telling his story based on his literal surroundings. Sermon on the Mount was near the Sea of Galilee. This sermon is probably near the River Jordan. So the other big difference is there's a big emphasis here in Luke, and why I really like this version, it says he dug deep and laid a foundation on the rock. I like that image because it explores like the process of building the house a little more. Instead of just saying he built his house on a rock, it says he had to work to get to the rock. He had to dig deep through the mud, through the muck, to get all the way down to bedrock, to get all the way down to make sure his house was founded on something secure. Here in Dallas, it's easiest for us to relate because we have a lot of soft clay soil, so there's a lot of settling, and part of your house might be higher than the other if you're like me at all. And so I think for us, this is very relatable for us. We know this experience, right? Maybe you've even had foundation problems at your house and you've had cracks and settling and different things happen. It's really nerve-wracking and it can be really difficult and expensive to fix. And so Jesus is saying something that we understand, right? That we know what it's like to have a house with a good foundation or a house with a bad foundation. You wouldn't want to buy a house without inspecting it first, without making sure its foundation was good and secure. And I think the same is true of our lives, right? That if we care that much about a house, how much more should we care about our hearts, about our souls? Which leads me to this next parable, which really dives into this distinction of having care for stuff versus having care for our souls. And Luke 12, starting with verse 13, it says, "Someone in the crowd said to him, 'Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me.' But he said to him, 'Man, who has made me a judge or arbiter over you?' And he said to him, 'Take care and be on guard against all covetousness. For one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions.' And he told them a parable, saying," so he has this conversation with a guy who wants Jesus to be an arbiter, a judge between this guy and his brother and how they're going to divide the inheritance. I've actually seen this happen literally in people's lives. As I was helping people prepare a funeral, they're squabbling and arguing over the will. They're squabbling over stuff when they're in the process of mourning. It happens more often than I care to admit. And Jesus gets thrown in the middle of it. And he says this parable in response to it. He says, the land of a rich man produced plentifully, and he thought to himself, what shall I do? For I have nowhere to store all my crops. He had more stuff than he knew what to do with. Sound familiar? And he said, I will do this. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and I'll store all my grains and goods. And I'll say to my soul, he's talking to himself, he says, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So is the one who lays up treasures for himself, hinting treasures on this planet, on earth, and is not rich towards God, not rich towards eternity, not rich laying up treasures in heaven. And so this parable helps us see this distinction between stuff for now and stuff for eternity. That one of our core attitudes is that Jesus teaches is that eternity matters most and that it's not about me. The Mark version of this story is one of the verses we use to describe that it's not about me and that eternity matters most. That more than anything, we don't want to focus on the here and now, but we want to see the bigger picture. We want to see the kingdom impact that our generosity can have. I've been convicted that as I've been studying each of these parables over the last few weeks, I've been really convicted that a lot of Jesus' parables are financial metaphors like this one. That a lot of his parables really attack the reality that we care so much about stuff and not enough about the things of God, that we get distracted. As I shared last week, Jesus shared the 4 types of soil, and one of them was a kind of soil with thorns and weeds that choke out with the deceitfulness of riches, choke out the goodness of God in his word. Paul says it this way, for the love of money is a root, again, a plant metaphor, a root of all kinds of evil. Now, money itself is not evil. It's the love of money that's evil. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pangs. I imagine this pierced like getting pricked with a thorn, cut with a thorn. It cuts us to the core. It harms us more than it helps us. Jesus says in Matthew 6, you can't serve 2 masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other. He will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon, or the love of money, or the idolatry of money, it says in Matthew 6:24. Jesus even tells parables in Luke 14 about excuses that we might have for being too busy for the kingdom of God. One excuse is he just bought a field. This might be like your current honey-do list, right? Of being all these things you have to do, like renovating your kitchen or fixing up your lawn or painting that room that you've been putting off or fixing something in your house or making your new backyard deck. That we can get distracted by all these honey-do lists instead of focusing on the more important things. Another example he gives is a new set of oxen, which is like for us a new car or new work equipment or new fancy electronics, that new fancy toy that you've been looking forward to using, that you spend all your time using instead of spending time with family and spending time in the Word. Or there's another one that says, I have a new relationship, a new wife. This could be focusing so much on relationships with others that you don't give enough time in silence and solitude with God, quiet time with God. And so Jesus tells these parables over and over and over again, driving home this same point that we are meant and destined for something much bigger than the things of this world. And as I shared last week, I really believe that God is removing some of the weeds of our everyday life, some of the distractions of our everyday life through this pandemic, that we are given the opportunity to go a little deeper with God and with our families, to actually have a little bit of extra time, to have family time around a table, just talking and laughing and sharing the joy of what's going on in our lives, and maybe even reading Scripture together for a few minutes each day, going a little deeper in the Word. I want to give you a couple of practical things on how we can live this out this week. First, if you're not already, I encourage you to give online. And if you're not comfortable putting your electronic information online, I encourage you to send a letter in the mail and maybe just we'll send that link and that address to you later. And I encourage you to have a habit of giving, that it's not just something you do sporadically, but it's something that you do consistently. Something I've been convicted about recently is studies have shown over the last few months during this pandemic around the world that consumption of sugary snacks is at an all-time high. Unfortunately, pornography use is an all-time high as well. But the one that really got my attention was that in the last couple of months, compared to this time last year, the consumption of alcohol is up 50% around the country, which shows us that people are taking on new habits, whether they're good or bad. There are good habits people are picking up as well. I've never seen this many people walking as a family unit, as a household unit in their neighborhood than I have in the last few weeks. It's been incredible to see families walking together, seeing other families like me pushing their kiddo in a stroller and walking and talking about deeper stuff, going deep as a family. I've seen people play more board games as a family, or even I've seen some of you online play the same board game across Zoom, which is super cool, and I encourage you to keep doing that. I encourage you to keep on taking new good habits of maybe taking a few extra moments now that you don't have a commute to go deep in the Word as an individual or as a household. I encourage you to take on new habits of generosity, to not hoard all the stuff that you have, but maybe share some of the food and things that you have with your neighbor, or even better, with a local food banks. Those food banks are empty right now. They're desperately in need of food. Share, if you have extra gloves or protective gear, share it with those first responders that need it most. And more than anything, I've been convicted that crisis like this exposes the bedrock of our life, whether we have a good foundation or none at all. That when we are focused on what we want to do and our timing, and we're bummed that we can't go watch a game, or you can't go to a concert, or can't even, I was thinking this week, I could use a haircut if my beard's getting a little long, can't go to the barber. It exposes that I put my hope in stuff, in entertainment, and going out. Or sometimes when we get really painfully lonely and desperate, maybe it's because we put our hope in people and popularity and being around other people instead of putting our hope exclusively in the Lord. When we get worried and anxious about the stock market and the economy, maybe it's because we put way too much hope in our future, in our money, in our stock portfolios, in our career. That when God takes some of these things away, we learn what we value and care about most. What matters most to us? Does eternity matter most to us, or is it something else? In the next few minutes, I encourage you to unpack these two discussion questions. First, what distractions, thorns, and false foundations have been uprooted and exposed during this current pandemic and trying season? And second, how can you learn to trust God more than these other things, than these things that could even become, if we are not careful, idols? And then the second thing is, what ways might you learn to grow in your generosity? And this isn't just about money. This isn't just about finances, though that's part of it. It's also, how can you use some of your gifts? My friend Anthony right now, he's learned how to bake sourdough bread and has been going and sharing that with others. Friends of mine have been helping us during this season when we have a baby, bringing us meals. Maybe you could do something like that. Or like I shared before, maybe you could donate some food or money to a local food bank that are desperately in need of funds and food. But more than anything, I want you to remember that we love because God first loved us. That we don't do any of this to earn God's love vertically from Him, but we do it because we've already been loved by Him. I hope you guys are having a great week, and I look forward to speaking and sharing more with you in the future. You guys have a great Sunday, and God bless. Once for all, I did.